Hey, Bastish BF for 64K and welcome to another Commodore 64 special. This one called
The Commodore 64 and the Exploding Fist Trilogy.
And welcome back. So in this episode we're going to have a look at all three games in the Exploding Fist series. There were a bunch of fighting games released for the Commodore 64. So let's not waste any more time and go back to the origins of the series in 1985. The Way of the Exploding Fist was released in 1985 on the Commodore 64 by Beam Software and published by Melbourne House. Beam were formed in 1980 in Melbourne, Australia. They were formed to produce books and software for all the old microcomputers of the time. These in turn were all published by Melbourne House, who put out their first piece of software in 1981. Beam quickly moved over to games development after releasing a bunch of top-selling software books that had type-in programs in them, which proved to be extremely popular. They decided then to shift focus onto software primarily over books. Enter Greg Barnett, a designer and coder that joined Beam in 1982. He started out by porting and writing some of Melbourne House's most successful games to the C64, such as The Hobbit, Sherlock, and Hungry Horace. But his first fully designed and programmed game by himself would start in 1984 and be released the following year. Here's Greg on the origins of the game.
Well, it was the first multi-move combat game ever made. I think on the Apple, a game called Karateka came out just before we released Fist, which had basically punch and kick, which wasn't much of a karate simulation. So this was we wanted something, it was an idea I came up with. I did know that one of the Japanese arcade companies was doing a karate game, and that actually came out before Fist. So Fist ended up sort of being compared a little bit to that.
The C64 was the platform of choice for this new versus fighting game. Bear in mind, by 1984 this genre was still virgin territory, with no one yet having fully delivered on the genre in full form as we know it today. At the time, Greg knew Data East was working on a similar styled game that would eventually beat them to the punch and be released as Karate Champ before Fist in mid-1984, but that didn't stop him. Here's Greg on the concept behind the game.
Well, it was just to have something first, to get something out there that was unique and new, and it was to do what we designed a game, which I think it had 16 karate moves, all based on the Commodore joystick initially, and then the keyboard on the Spectrum. What can I say? It was a fun game to do. Well, again, it was one of these games you think there's pressure on you. Can you finish it? But when you look at it, it only took 4 months or something.
The game itself was a 1 or 2 player versus karate simulator. Fight your way up, taking out one opponent at a time with increased difficulty. Unlike the majority of modern fighting games, you only needed one hit to end a round. Completing the 2 yin-yangs at the top of the screen ends the match. This was based on a real scoring system known as Shobu Nihon Kumite and is used in many forms of karate. The game also features a bonus round where you get charged by a bull. You can either dodge it or take it down with one precise low punch. These bonus rounds were actually based on karate expert Mas Oyama, who founded Kyokushin Karate, which is the most famous form of the full contact sport. From about the mid-50s, he toured the world introducing this form to the masses, as well as giving live demonstrations which included knocking out bulls with a single strike. He battled 52 bulls, knocking 49 out and killing 3 instantly with a single strike, earning him the nickname God Hand. And as a side note, he also trained one of my favorite movie martial artists, the crazy Sonny Chiba. The game itself managed to infuse its 18 moves to pure perfection on the joystick with only one button. It worked fantastically and made the clunky 2-stick style of Karate Champ seem archaic as soon as it was released. The graphics themselves were phenomenal, extremely well animated with some wonderful background classic Japanese style vistas. Here's Greg on compiling the game for the first time and seeing people's reactions.
I was never one of the guys that what we used to call them hackers even in those days, who will sort of do things on the fly. You sit at the computer and just type and then compile. I like to plan everything out and get it going. So nobody had seen anything to do with Exploding Fist for it must have been 6 weeks or whatever it was. Nothing had been happening. Everybody was starting to get a bit worried. And then one compile, and suddenly the 2-player game, that is without any AI, was working straight away. So it went from nothing to a 2-player game basically straight away, which was and then you know when you're onto something because did the compile, tested it, works. Well, we've got something here. I'll go and get a cup of coffee, and I come back and there's a line of people to play the game in the office at my machine. So that was when we knew we were onto something pretty good at that point.
They also managed to sign up then world karate champion Jeffrey Thompson to help promote the game. It was initially going to be named after him, but it was then decided that his name recognition with the general public wasn't high enough, and the way the Exploding Fist was chosen instead. And we cannot talk about this game without mentioning its brilliant combination of music and sound effects, which truly made it stand apart from the rest of the pack. Neil Brennan, the game's music composer, who also did music for the entire series, as well as future Beam classics such as Samurai Warrior and Rock and Wrestle, joined Beam when he was just 19 years old. He was doing music for both their Spectrum and C64 titles. Here's Neil on the obvious differences sound-wise for the two systems. The Spectrum didn't have much room in its memory for music, but it was a horrible device for sound, with a nasty little speaker we could only click on and off. We called it Clickatron. With all the tools at our disposal, we could only get 2 simultaneous voices out of the thing at the best of times, and that by clever PWM maths. The C64 on the other hand had a wonderful SID chip with multiple channels, different oscillators, noise filters, and ring modulation. It was like a tiny little poorly quality controlled synth in a box, or beepatron if you will. I loved it. It let me actually write interesting pieces with approximations of real instruments and had that bit more memory for me to play with, so it was always my first choice if I had one. Neil's main music track for the game was actually a remix of sorts of a classical song called Dance of the Yow People, which was suggested by Fred Milgram, one of the bosses at Melbourne House at the time. Fred enjoyed classical music, not just Western, and not only for its beauty and melodic richness, but also because it was out of copyright. That he loved. The music is a large part in what makes this game so good. Extremely atmospheric, complementing the slightly slower nature of the action perfectly. The sound effects were all samples from old kung fu movies, as well as that iconic Bruce Lee scream on the title screen, which almost gave a 10-year-old me a complete heart attack on loading it up for the first time, as I had the old TV sound cranked up already. They are loud and crunchy and really made the impacts feel legit. Just go and play the Spectrum version for a complete opposite experience. The game was a massive success, becoming the #1 selling game in the UK in 1985, selling over 500,000 copies. And considering how rampant piracy was at the time, that is an extremely impressive number. It was also universally applauded, with Commodore users giving it a 5 out of 5 and Zap64 giving it a much-deserved 93% overall. This game was extremely influential, including System 3 basically cloning it for their 1986 release International Karate, and it also forming the basis for all modern fighters to come, even more so than 1984's Karate Champ. This was my first original game I ever bought for my Commodore 64 and helped form the basis of why I love my beloved C64 so much. It's time for the sequel. Let's check out 1986. Fist 2: The Legend Continues was released in 1986 by Beam Software and published by Melbourne House again. With great success always comes a sequel, but this was a whole lot more than a mere clone of the previous game and slapping a 2 on the end of it. But would it be what people want? Work started on this game immediately after the success of Fist 1, but this time they wanted to try something a bit different, infusing an action-adventure element while still keeping the base fighting mechanic. Greg Barnett was back as coder and designer, with Neil Brennan again delivering the tunes. The result, however, is a polarizing game that you either love or hate. I'm in the first camp, but the game isn't without its issues. There are many of them in fact, but the strange barren exploration aspect always kind of appealed to me for whatever reason. The game this time actually has a story, at least if you bothered to read the instructions, involving your land being overthrown by an evil warlord who enslaved your people and destroyed your temples containing the scrolls which contain all the secret moves of the Exploding Fist martial arts. Your goal is to explore and travel the lands searching for the scrolls. Once found, you take the scrolls to the nearest ruined temple and pray. This now gives you its power power and also an extra life. You end up encountering many of the Warlord's henchmen along the way, which initiates the fight sequences, which play out pretty much like a round of the original game, with the exception being that each player now has an energy bar, so multiple hits are needed to kill an opponent. The game map is pretty big, and I had to use one of those maps from an old Zap 64 issue back in the day to figure everything out. What is cool about this game is, as soon as it starts, it has a complete open world kind of feel, and by design it is, which is very impressive. Either going left or right straight from the start sends you down a completely different path. It is, however, all open, so you are not forced to choose one or the other, but have to essentially go everywhere in the end. The locations are wide and varied, from jungles, dojos, caverns, waterfalls, dungeons, all the while being attacked by henchmen, dogs, and assassins. The game is pretty slow for the most part, which for me was a welcome change from the games where you were essentially being attacked every second without a moment to breathe. Some might find it boring, which is not an unreasonable criticism. Neil Brennan, however, outdid himself with the soundtrack. It's one of the most atmospheric sets of tracks used in any adventure game, and what I like the most, unlike 90% of the games at the time, depending on the location you go to, the music changes to set the mood. It's brilliant. The cave dungeon tune really creeped me out as a kid, so much so that I refused to play this game at night and only in daylight. Besides the adventure game, on the flip side of the cassette was a complete tournament mode, which was essentially Fist 1 with different graphics. It's an impressive addition and was probably Greg and the crew's way to appease original fans while still taking risks with the main game. With all the positives done, let's check out the laundry list of issues this game has. First off, it just starts. There is no title screen. When you die, there's no game over. It just resets. It really kind of feels sloppy. Graphical glitches are pretty common, from funky scrolling to glitchy sprites. Without reading the instructions, this game has no on-screen cues or direction, which can result in you aimlessly wandering around forever not knowing what to do. Most locations also have no interactive elements, so wandering around is definitely a gameplay flaw in a sense. If you haven't found a scroll and prayed at a shrine, then dying results in an instant game over, which, if you've been playing the game for a couple of hours, is a pretty tough nut to swallow. The tournament mode, at least for me, is essentially ruined simply because they implemented the energy system from the adventure game instead of the original one-hit round system. It makes every versus match literally take forever to play through and ruins whatever made the original fighting elements so much fun. Having said all that, I still like the adventure element despite its many flaws. Its slow, pondering nature and the combination of fights and that wonderful music made this a firm favorite of mine during those early C64 days. Like I said in the beginning, you either like or hate this game, and the reviews of the time definitely reflect that, with vast differences of opinions in all my favorite magazines. Zap 64 were absolutely brutal with this one, having nothing good to say at all, which I think is a bit ridiculous, giving it an overall 39% in issue number 20. They hated everything, including Neil Brennan's soundtrack, which is way off base in my opinion. Commodore User, on the other hand, gave it an 8 out of 10 overall, with them praising the adventure element with an addictive quality of trying to find all those scrolls. I think Greg and the team really infused this game with a ton of ambition and some great ideas. Not all of it works, but the attempt to do something so different back then should be applauded. And if you've never tried it before, it's an interesting game that you're either gonna love or hate. And our final stop today is 1988 for the last game in the series. And the final game in the series was called Exploding Fist Plus, released in 1988 by Beam and published this time by Firebird. Where the first game was cloned by System 3 to make International Karate, Melbourne House finally got the chance to return the favor and get revenge and clone System 3's recently released RK Plus for their new game. The cloning circle was finally complete. The game goes back to its roots by being a straight up versus fighting game again, with the difference in there being 3 players on screen at once. 2 can be human and 1's computer, just like RK Plus. And even though there are now 3 characters on screen at once, the speed of the game is much faster than the previous 2 versions, and does give the game a much more frantic feel. Unlike the original, it's no longer one hit ends around. You can land as many hits as you can before the time runs out. The winner and the runner-up go to the next round, with the third wheel being eliminated. Every 2 rounds the gameplay is broken broken up with a minigame, which can be best described as a blatant ripoff of Sega's Shinobi Arcade, with you having to throw darts at hordes of ninjas that are coming towards you. If one gets close enough, it's game over and back to the versus action. Unfortunately, this time Greg Barnett was not back for design or programming, and it feels like a lot of the charm and attention to detail is actually missing from this game. Neil Brennan is back, fortunately, but the main tune is kind of annoying and bland, with the second one being a kind of a remix of one of the Fist 2 soundtracks, which is actually pretty good. Overall though, this is not his best work. It almost seems like these were just leftover tracks that they didn't use for the previous games. The graphics are, however, pretty good. They are nothing special in the fact that they still are the exact same animations from the 1985 original, just being recycled with a couple of new moves like the cartwheel and the Double Dragon ripped off elbow hit. They also decided to clone the one background idea from OK Plus, which works really well in that game because of all the fun random animations that are happening in the background. But this one is just a bland New York street with a few flashy neon signs. It's kinda disappointing. The minigame is at least fun, but nowhere near as good as Shinobi's version, obviously, which sums up this game in a nutshell. It's simply an inferior version of a much better game. It's kind of a real pity that this was the final Fist game, as it's just so forgettable. If you can ignore the fact that Arcade Plus exists, it's a decent versus fighting game that you can actually have quite a bit of fun with. It does play well, and even though again the sound effects are exactly the same as the previous two games without any additions, they are still loud and crunchy and give the action a really solid feel. Overall, I feel like this was a quickly put together cash grab, and the Exploding Fist name just deserved a much better fitting ending than this. It ended up receiving mid reviews across the board in almost every magazine. Commodore User in the December 88 issue gave it its highest marks with 75% overall, although they weren't generally positive at all by saying Beam Software, who wrote the original, really haven't stretched themselves this time. Even the sound has no new effects, while the tune is actually considerably worse. And Zap64 were unusually kinda in their February 89 issue, giving it 68% overall, but saying a good but expensive beat 'em up and not as polished as RK Plus. So I hope you enjoyed that little retrospective on the Exploding Fist series on the Commodore 64. So I'm Bastish B for 64K, I hope you had a good time. If you can please like and subscribe, they'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.